I let my brother think he was the favorite, until Mom's deathbed confession revealed the truth. The wooden floors creaked under my feet as I paced around the hospital waiting room, my hands trembling slightly from too much coffee and not enough sleep. 3 days had passed since Mom collapsed in her kitchen, and the doctors weren't giving us much hope anymore. My younger brother sat in the corner chair, his face buried in his hands, looking like the world was ending around him. Growing up, it always felt like he was the golden child while I was just there, existing in the background of their perfect relationship. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone seemed to revolve around him and his achievements. When he brought home straight A's, Mom would hang them on the refrigerator with those little flower magnets she collected. When I managed to scrape together mostly B's with a few A's mixed in, she'd glance at the report card and tell me to try harder next time. The pattern started early and never really stopped throughout our childhood years. He got the bigger bedroom when we moved to the new house because Mom said he needed more space for his books and projects. I got the smaller room that faced the alley where garbage trucks rumbled by at 5 in the morning every Tuesday. When he wanted to take expensive music lessons, Mom somehow found the money in the budget. When I asked about joining the school basketball team, she worried about the cost of equipment and travel expenses. Family dinners became showcases for his latest accomplishments, while my contributions to the conversation seemed to fade into the background noise. He'd talk about winning some academic competition or getting selected for a special program, and Mom's eyes would light up with pride. I'd mention something interesting that happened at school or a project I was working on, and she'd nod politely before steering the conversation back to him. The favoritism became more obvious as we got older and started making bigger life decisions. When he chose his college, Mom spent weeks helping him research programs and fill out applications. She drove him to campus visits and toured dormitories like she was the one who'd be living there. When my time came to apply for schools, she handed me a stack of brochures and told me to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Even after we both moved out and started our own lives, the pattern continued in subtle ways that stung just as much as the obvious ones from childhood. Holiday gatherings revolved around his schedule and his family's needs. When he got married, Mom threw herself into wedding planning like it was her own second wedding. When I got engaged a few years later, she seemed distracted and kept comparing everything to how his wedding had been organized. The phone calls were another painful reminder of where I stood in the family hierarchy. She'd call him multiple times a week just to chat about random things or ask his opinion on decisions she was making. My phone rang maybe once a month, usually when she needed something specific or wanted to pass along information that she thought I should know. Those conversations felt functional rather than loving, like items being checked off a to-do list. Money became another source of obvious favoritism as Mom got older and started thinking about her legacy. When he needed a down payment for his first house, she somehow managed to come up with $20,000 from her savings. When I mentioned struggling with student loan payments, she suggested I look into consolidation options and maybe get a second job to help make ends meet. The holidays were particularly difficult because the inequity became impossible to ignore when we were all together. Gift-giving revealed the disparity in both thought and financial investment. His presents were carefully chosen, expensive, and clearly reflected hours of consideration about what would make him happy. Mine felt like afterthoughts, generic items that could have been purchased for anyone. During family photos, Mom would position herself next to him and make sure they were both prominently featured in the center of every shot. I'd end up on the edges, sometimes partially cut off when the pictures got printed or shared online. Looking through old photo albums became an exercise in spotting this pattern repeated across decades of family gatherings and special occasions. The emotional distance created by this favoritism affected how I related to both Mom and my brother throughout our adult years. I found myself pulling away from family events, making excuses to avoid gatherings where I'd have to watch their special bond play out in front of everyone. The resentment built up slowly but steadily, like water filling a bucket one drop at a time. My brother seemed completely oblivious to the dynamics that were so obvious to me. He'd call and complain about Mom being too involved in his life, too interested in his decisions, too eager to help with problems he wanted to solve himself. Meanwhile, I was dealing with the opposite problem, feeling like I had to handle everything alone because asking for help felt pointless and potentially humiliating. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was annoyed by the attention I would have given anything to receive. He'd roll his eyes when Mom called during our rare get-togethers, sighing about how she worried too much and wanted to be involved in every aspect of his life. I'd sit there thinking about how nice it would be to have someone care that much about my daily routine and long-term plans. When Mom got sick, the favoritism continued even in the face of a serious health crisis. She'd ask him to handle the important decisions about treatment options and insurance paperwork. I was assigned tasks like picking up prescriptions and driving her to routine appointments. Even facing her own mortality, she seemed to trust him more with the significant responsibilities. The 3 months of her illness revealed new layers of the dynamic I'd been living with my entire life. She'd perk up noticeably when he entered the room, asking about his work and his family with genuine interest and energy. When I visited, she seemed tired and distracted, going through the motions of conversation without the spark that appeared when he was around. Hospital visits became another stage for the same old patterns to play out. She'd save her good days for his visits, putting on makeup and asking the nurses to help her sit up properly in bed. On the days when only I came by, she'd lie flat against the pillows, looking exhausted and uninterested in maintaining appearances. The nursing staff noticed the difference too, though they were too professional to comment directly. I could see it in their faces when they watched our interactions compared to the animated conversations she'd have with him. They'd smile and nod when he was there, clearly charmed by their dynamic. With me, they maintained polite distance, probably sensing the tension that I couldn't hide. Medical updates became another source of inequality during those final months. She'd call him immediately after doctor appointments to discuss test results and treatment options. I'd find out about developments secondhand, usually days later when someone remembered to fill me in on what was happening with her condition. The night before she died, I sat alone in her hospital room while he went home to get some sleep before what we all knew would be a difficult final day. She was drifting in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow and labored. I held her hand and tried to think of something meaningful to say, some way to bridge the gap that had existed between us for so long. Around midnight, she opened her eyes and looked at me with a clarity that hadn't been there for weeks. Her voice was barely a whisper, but I could hear every word as she started talking about things she'd never shared before. The confession that came out changed everything I thought I knew about our family and my place in it. She told me that I wasn't just her son, but the child she'd fought for when everyone else told her she was making a mistake. My biological father had been her first love, someone her parents disapproved of because he came from a different background and didn't meet their expectations for their daughter's future. When she got pregnant, they pressured her to give me up for adoption and pretend the whole thing never happened. Instead, she'd run away and lived in a tiny apartment across town, working multiple jobs to support us both during my first few years of life. She'd been 17 when I was born, barely more than a child herself, but she'd chosen to keep me despite the enormous challenges and social stigma she faced as a single teenage mother. The man I'd always called Dad had come into our lives when I was 3 years old, and while he'd agreed to raise me as his own, Mom had always felt like she needed to compensate for the disruption my existence had caused in his life. She'd tried to make things easier for him by being the primary disciplinarian and handling most of the responsibilities related to my care and upbringing. My brother was their biological child together, born into a stable marriage with two parents who were ready and excited to start a family. Mom had always felt guilty about the contrast between his easy beginning and my complicated start, so she'd overcompensated by giving him the attention and advantages she wished she could have provided for me from the beginning. The favoritism I'd interpreted as preference was actually her way of trying to give him the childhood she felt I'd been denied due to the circumstances of my birth. She'd convinced herself that being stricter with me and expecting more independence would somehow make up for the instability of my early years. Every decision that had felt like rejection was actually her attempt to prepare me for a world she believed would be harder for me to navigate. She'd pushed me towards self-reliance because she worried about what would happen to me if I became too dependent on others. The extra help and attention she'd given him came from her assumption that I was naturally stronger and more capable of handling adversity. The money she'd saved for his house down payment had originally been set aside for my education, but she'd given it to him instead when she saw how well I was managing financially on my own. She'd been proud of my independence, but afraid that praising me too much would make me complacent or entitled. All those years of feeling like the less important child, I'd actually been the one she worried about most and thought about constantly. She'd spent decades trying to figure out how to balance being fair to both of us while dealing with her own guilt and regret about the circumstances that had shaped our family. The photos where I appeared on the edges weren't about favoritism, but about her attempt to let me choose my own level of involvement in family activities. She'd noticed that I seemed uncomfortable being the center of attention, and had tried to respect what she interpreted as my preference for staying in the background. Her frequent phone calls with him weren't about loving him more, but about his need for more guidance and support in making decisions. She'd always seen me as the more mature and capable one, someone who could figure things out independently without requiring constant input and reassurance from parents. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours, with her sharing details about sacrifices she'd made and worries she'd carried that I'd never known about. She'd worked extra shifts to pay for things I needed while telling me we couldn't afford them, not wanting me to feel guilty about the financial strain my existence had placed on the family. She'd attended every school event and achievement ceremony, even when she had to leave work early or rearrange her schedule to be there. The lukewarm reactions to my successes weren't about lack of pride, but about her fear that too much praise would make me feel different from my brother or draw attention to the complicated dynamics in our family. The medical decisions she'd asked him to handle weren't about trust, but about her desire to protect me from having to make difficult choices about her care. She'd seen how much the situation was affecting me, and had tried to spare me from the additional burden of responsibility for treatment decisions. Every birthday and holiday gift had been chosen with careful consideration of what I might need or want, but she deliberately kept them modest because she worried about creating resentment between us if the inequality became too obvious. She'd saved money throughout the year to buy things I mentioned wanting, then second-guessed herself and chosen safer, more practical alternatives. The academic expectations and stricter rules hadn't been about favoritism, but about her belief that I had more potential and natural ability than my brother. She'd pushed me harder because she'd seen capabilities in me that she'd wanted to help develop, while giving him more assistance because she'd worried about his ability to succeed independently. Her involvement in his wedding planning had been motivated by his anxiety about the event and his requests for help with decisions that overwhelmed him. She'd wanted to be equally involved in my wedding, but I'd seemed confident and capable of handling the arrangements without interference from parents. The revelation completely reframed every interaction and decision that had shaped our relationship over the years. The distance I'd felt wasn't about her loving me less, but about her complicated feelings regarding her own choices and their impact on our family dynamics. As she finished talking, I could see the exhaustion settling back into her features. She'd used what little energy she had left to finally tell me the truth about our relationship and the reasoning behind decisions that had caused me decades of pain and confusion. I sat there holding her hand, trying to process how fundamentally wrong I'd been about everything. The favoritism I'd resented was actually her flawed attempt to balance competing concerns about fairness, protection, and preparation for adulthood. She'd been trying to do right by both of us while managing her own guilt and uncertainty about parenting decisions. The next morning, she passed away peacefully with both of us at her bedside. My brother was devastated, crying openly as the nurses came in to handle the arrangements. I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief, sad to lose her but grateful for the conversation that had changed everything about how I understood our relationship. The funeral planning revealed more evidence of the truth she'd shared with me. Going through her personal belongings, I found boxes of pictures and mementos from my childhood that she'd carefully preserved. There were report cards she'd kept, awards I'd won, and letters I'd written to her over the years, all stored in protective sleeves and organized chronologically. Her financial records showed regular contributions to a savings account in my name that I'd never known about, money she'd set aside throughout the years for emergencies or opportunities that might arise in my life. The account contained enough money to pay off my remaining student loans and provide a substantial emergency fund for my family. In her jewelry box, I found a locket containing my baby picture alongside a note explaining that she'd worn it under her clothes for 32 years, keeping me close to her heart even when our relationship felt distant and complicated. The note apologized for not being able to find better ways to show her love and expressed pride in the man I'd become despite her parenting mistakes. The will reading provided the final piece of evidence that everything I'd believed about our family dynamics had been wrong. While the house and most of the obvious assets were left to my brother, the bulk of her actual wealth had been quietly designated for me, including investment accounts and life insurance policies I'd never known existed. The lawyer explained that she'd structured things this way because she'd believed my brother would need the stability and emotional comfort of the family home, while I would benefit more from the financial independence that money could provide. Even in death, she'd been trying to give each of us what she thought would serve us best. My brother was shocked by the revelations, having been completely unaware of the circumstances of my birth and the complexity of Mom's feelings about our family structure. He'd genuinely believed that he was the preferred child and had never questioned the dynamics that had caused me so much pain over the years. The conversations we had after the funeral were difficult but necessary, as we both tried to understand how our perceptions of the same events had been so different. He'd felt pressure to live up to expectations, and had envied what he'd seen as my freedom from parental scrutiny and interference. We started having regular dinners together, sharing memories and trying to build a relationship based on who we actually were rather than the roles we'd played in our family drama. The resentment I'd carried for decades began to fade, as I understood that he'd been just as affected by Mom's complicated approach to parenting as I had been. The inheritance money allowed me to make changes in my life that I'd been putting off for years due to financial constraints. I was able to pursue interests and opportunities that had seemed impossible when I was struggling to make ends meet, while feeling like I couldn't ask for help from family. More importantly, the truth about Mom's feelings and motivations freed me from the anger and disappointment that had colored my perspective on our relationship for so long. I could finally appreciate the sacrifices she'd made and the love she'd felt, even when her way of expressing it had been confusing and hurtful. The experience taught me that family relationships are often much more complicated than they appear on the surface, and that assumptions about other people's motivations can be completely wrong even when the evidence seems overwhelming. Sometimes the people we think care the least are actually the ones who worry about us the most. I still miss her, but now I miss the mother I actually had rather than grieving for the relationship I thought we should have had. Understanding her perspective doesn't erase the pain of those years, but it does provide context that makes forgiveness possible and helps me appreciate the love that was always there, even when I couldn't see it. The whole experience changed how I approach relationships with my own children, making me more conscious of how my actions and decisions might be interpreted and more direct about expressing my feelings and motivations. I never want them to spend years wondering about their place in my heart, the way I wondered about mine in hers. Looking back, I realized that the deathbed confession wasn't just about setting the record straight, but about giving me the tools to understand and heal from decades of misunderstanding. She used her final hours to provide the clarity that could have saved us both years of pain if she'd found the courage to share it earlier. The story serves as a reminder that sometimes the truth is more complicated and more loving than what we can see from our limited perspective, and that the people we think understand us least might actually be the ones who see us most clearly and care about us most deeply.